Before the victims were buried, the paperwork was already filed. That single fact defines everything that makes Nomia Rosemary Enlovu's case unlike almost anything else in the history of South African law enforcement. She did not kill in anger or under the pressure of a spiraling moment. She planned each death, insured each life before it ended, and collected the money afterward. She did this 6 times. She was a uniformed police sergeant throughout. Enlovu joined the South African Police Service in 1994 and rose to the rank of sergeant. Colleagues described her as reserved and private. What none of them knew was that she was quietly constructing a financial operation built entirely on the deaths of the people closest to her. The instrument was life insurance. The method was arranged violence. The victims were family. The first to die was her cousin, witness Madala Homu, in 2012, found murdered near Olifantsfontein, the death absorbed into South Africa's already devastating homicide statistics. When Enlovu collected the insurance payout, no alarm was raised. The transaction moved through the system without scrutiny. In 2013, her sister Audrey died under circumstances investigators would later examine closely. At the time, her death was attributed to illness. Enlovu collected again. The most viscerally disturbing case in her series came in October 2015. Her boyfriend, Maurice Mabasa, was ambushed and attacked with extraordinary ferocity, stabbed dozens of times in what investigators described as excessive and prolonged. Enlovu had taken out multiple life insurance policies on Mabasa worth more than 400,000 rand. She appeared publicly distraught at the funeral. She filed her claims, collected the payouts, and continued reporting for duty. Over the following years, the killings continued. A niece, a nephew, additional relatives, each death engineered to blend into a country whose homicide rate was among the highest in the world. That backdrop was not incidental. She understood it and counted on it. Deaths in under-resourced communities rarely attracted sustained investigation. For years, neither did her. By 2018, she had collected the equivalent of tens of thousands of US dollars through 6 confirmed murders, all while maintaining her position inside the police service. What unraveled her was overreach. That year, Dr. Enlovu attempted to arrange the murder of her own elderly mother, planning to have the house burned down with her mother inside and collecting one final payout. The men she approached made a different choice. Instead of carrying out the attack, they went to authorities and agreed to record their conversations with her. In those recordings, Enlovu discussed the planned killing with a composure that prosecutors and journalists described as chilling. She spoke about timing, method, and payment in the same measured tone one might use for a routine transaction. There was no audible conflict, no hesitation. When those recordings were played at her 2021 trial, the silence that followed each exchange carried its own verdict. The trial became a national event in South Africa. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, yet confronting for the first time a complete picture of what had been done to their relatives. The evidence against Enlovu was comprehensive. Insurance documents in her handwriting, bank records of each payout, forensic connections to the murders, and testimony from the men she had tried to recruit. The defense maintained her innocence, but the combination of physical evidence and recorded audio left almost no space for doubt. One investigator's statement to the court captured her approach in a single line. She treated human lives like numbers in a bank account. On October 22, 2021, Enlovu was convicted of 6 counts of murder, attempted murder, fraud, and defeating the ends of justice. On November 5th, she was sentenced to 6 life terms, plus additional time for the fraud convictions. She showed almost no visible emotion as the sentence was read. Her case raises a structural question that outlasts the verdict. How does a serving police officer orchestrate 6 murders over 6 years without detection? Part of the answer lies in context. Under-resourced communities, overburdened investigators, and a country whose homicide rate made any individual death easier to absorb. But the deeper answer concerns trust. Her department trusted her. Her family trusted her, and insurance systems trusted her documents. Every institution that should have been a check extended her the benefit of the doubt because the uniform and the family ties all pointed the same direction. She weaponized all of it. Nomia Rosemary Enlovu will spend the rest of her life in a South African prison. The people she killed were not strangers. They were people who loved her, and she had signed the documents before any of them knew what was coming. For 23 years, she worked inside the system that should have caught her. She attended roll calls, built a career in the LAPD, earned the respect of her colleagues, and stood in courtrooms on the side of the law, all while the body of the woman she had killed sat in an unsolved homicide file. She shared the same institutional corridors as the detectives who, had they looked more carefully at the right moment, might have found her. For 23 years, nothing happened. Then a piece of biological evidence preserved in a refrigerated envelope for over 2 decades ended everything. The murder of Sherry Rasmussen occurred on February 24, 1986, in her home in Van Nuys, California. Sherry was 29 years old, recently married, and the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Her husband, John Rutten, Eddie had left for work that morning. When he returned, he found Sherry dead on the living room floor. She had been beaten, bitten, and shot 3 times with a .38 caliber revolver. The scene had been staged to look like a burglary. The staging worked initially. In 1986, the LAPD was contending with historically high homicide rates. The case went cold, but a name existed in the file. Sherry had confided in her father before she died that she was frightened of a woman named Stephanie Lazarus, an LAPD officer who had previously been in a relationship with John Rutten. Lazarus had allegedly confronted Sherry directly, warning that if she couldn't have John, no one else would. Sherry's father passed this to investigators. It was noted. It was not pursued. Lazarus was one of their own. Lazarus continued her career uninterrupted. She rose through LAPD ranks, eventually joining the elite art theft unit. She married a fellow officer, adopted a daughter, and built a life that looked from every external angle exactly like that of a trustworthy public servant. In 2005, a cold case investigator applied DNA technology that had not existed in 1986. The bite mark on Sherry's arm, preserved in evidence, became the focus. Analysis revealed that the attacker had been a woman. The burglary narrative collapsed. This had been a personal crime. When investigators dug into Sherry's history, they encountered immediately, unavoidably, Hambao, the name that had been in the file for 19 years. The investigation was conducted in absolute secrecy. Lazarus still carried a badge and had access to LAPD resources. If she suspected she was being watched, the consequences could have been severe. Detectives followed her covertly, collected a DNA sample from a discarded cup, and submitted it to the lab. The result matched the biological evidence from 1986. On June 5, 2009, Lazarus was called into an interrogation room under the pretense of assisting an unrelated case. She walked in as a respected detective. She walked out in handcuffs. The recording of that interrogation was later released and became one of the most widely viewed police interview recordings in true crime history. Watching Lazarus, calm, credentialed, composed, gradually understand that she is the subject and not the helper is uniquely uncomfortable to witness. The composure erodes in small, precise increments. A viewer can almost identify the exact moment she grasps that 23 years of safety have just ended. Her trial began in 2012. The prosecution built its case around the DNA match, Sherry's documented fear, and the staged crime scene as evidence of premeditated concealment. The defense challenged the handling of the biological evidence and raised the possibility of another female contributor, but the jury was not persuaded. On March 8, 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life. For Sherry Rasmussen's family, particularly her father, who had named Lazarus to investigators in 1986 and been effectively ignored, the verdict was a vindication 26 years in the making. He had been right from the beginning. In 2024, her parole eligibility was pushed back further. She will not be considered until well into the 2030s. Her case is not only a story of jealousy and violence, it is a story about institutional loyalty, the instinct embedded in law enforcement culture to extend colleagues the benefit of the doubt, to avoid the uncomfortable possibility that someone wearing the same badge might be a suspect. Sherry's father gave investigators the right name in 1986. The gap between that conversation and the arrest in 2009 is 23 years. In those 23 years, Lazarus built a career and lived freely on the authority that should have brought her to justice. DNA does not extend professional courtesy. It does not protect its own. In the end, it was the only part of the system that told the truth from the beginning. 4 words, said without panic, without tears, without any visible attempt to construct a story. When NYPD officer Ivon Wu stepped outside the house on 19th Avenue in Bensonhurst and placed her service weapon on the ground, she didn't run. She raised her hands, waited for her colleagues to arrive, and when they did, she delivered her account in 11 syllables. I shot them both, October 13th, 2021, a cool fall evening in Brooklyn that ended with 2 women shot inside a house and 1 decorated police officer standing motionless in the street outside. Inside, Jaime Leung, 24 years old, Widuiki Fran, had been fatally wounded. Jenny Lee, Wu's former girlfriend, had survived, hit multiple times and struggling to remain conscious. This was not a robbery, not a call that had spiraled. It was the endpoint of an obsession, a slow accumulation of jealousy and loss that had been building for months. Ivon Wu had served in the NYPD's 72nd Precinct for 7 years. At work, colleagues described her as disciplined, capable, and consistent. No documented incidents, no complaints, no indicators in her personnel record that anything was wrong. She was, by all institutional measures, a model officer. The measure the institution could not track was what was happening outside of work. Wu had been in a long-term relationship with Jenny Lee. Friends described the attachment as unusually intense. When the relationship deteriorated and ended, Wu struggled to find a way forward. When Lee began a new relationship with Jaime Leung, something in Wu shifted past grief into something more dangerous. The person she had depended on had moved on. The space she had occupied in Lee's life was now filled by someone else. For someone whose professional life demanded and rewarded control, losing that personal anchor appears to have been unbearable. On the night of October 13th, Wu drove to Jenny Lee's home, uninvited. Lee was inside with Jaime Leung, an ordinary evening for 2 people in a new relationship. When Wu entered, the confrontation escalated rapidly. According to prosecutors, Wu drew her service weapon, the same gun the NYPD had issued her, trained her to use, and trusted her to carry for 7 years, and opened fire. Neighbors recalled 3 or 4 shots cutting through the quiet fall street. Jaime Leung was struck and died almost immediately. Jenny Lee was hit multiple times but managed to move toward the door, seriously injured but alive. Wu walked outside to set the gun down and waited in silence. That composure, the absence of flight, denial, or visible panic, became one of the most discussed aspects of the case, whether it was shock, resignation, or the trained self-control of a person who had already accepted what was coming. No outside observer can fully determine. But it was striking and, in its stillness, deeply unsettling. For the NYPD, the aftermath offered no comfortable resolution. One of their officers had taken a weapon issued for public protection and used it against 2 civilians over a personal dispute. The question of what warning mechanisms existed and whether any of them could have detected what was building did not produce satisfying answers. In court, the prosecution presented a portrait of a woman unable to release what she had come to see as hers. The defense introduced Wu's documented mental health struggles and the psychological deterioration that preceded October 13th as mitigating context. Neither framing changed the central facts. 2 women had been shot in their own home, one fatally, by a police officer who had no authority to be there. In June 2024, Wu pleaded guilty to manslaughter and attempted murder. In August 2024, she was sentenced to 27 years in prison. She was 33 years old. The prime of her life will be spent behind bars. The sentence generated debate. Some argued it was insufficient for an officer who had turned a badge-issued weapon on civilians over a personal dispute. Others cited her mental health history and previously clean record as mitigating factors. Neither argument could restore what had been lost. Jaime Leung's family lost their daughter not to a stranger or circumstance, but to a jealousy that carried a gun the public had trusted it to use with judgment and restraint. Ivon Wu stood outside that house, hands raised, weapon on the ground, and said 4 words that required no elaboration. She already knew it was over, and in a case built around obsession, institutional trust, and the abuse of authorized force, that particular stillness is perhaps the most unsettling thing she left behind. Here are the facts no one disputes. On the morning of January 29, 2022, in Canton, Massachusetts, Boston police officer John O'Keefe was found unconscious in the snow outside the home of a fellow officer. It was below freezing. He had been there for hours. He died from a combination of hypothermia and blunt force trauma. His body showed cuts, bruises, and bite marks. That is where the agreement ends. What caused those injuries, who is responsible, and whether the investigation was conducted honestly for us. Those questions remain contested. This is one of the most closely watched and unresolved cases in recent American legal history. John O'Keefe was a 16-year veteran of the Boston Police Department, well-liked by colleagues and respected in his community. He had taken in his late sister's children and was raising them. His death, however it occurred, was a genuine tragedy. His girlfriend Karen Reed was a financial analyst and adjunct professor. On the night of January 28th, the two had been out together. At approximately 12:30 in the morning, they left a bar. O'Keefe never made it home alive. The prosecution's account is direct. They say Reed dropped O'Keefe at a house party hosted by a fellow officer, then drove away in her Lexus SUV while intoxicated and agitated, striking O'Keefe with the rear of the vehicle before leaving. They contend she did not call for help, leaving him badly injured in below-freezing temperatures. Their forensic evidence included broken tail light material found near the body, which investigators attributed to Reed's SUV, and injuries they argued were consistent with a vehicular impact followed by prolonged cold exposure. But Karen Reed's account is categorically different and far more destabilizing in its implications. Reed and her defense team maintained from the beginning that she had not struck O'Keefe and that he had been assaulted inside the house by individuals at the party, and several connected to law enforcement, before being placed outside in the snow. They argued the blue wall of silence was not a figure of speech, but an active mechanism suppressing the truth. The defense challenged the forensic evidence directly. The tail light fragments, they argued, showed patterns inconsistent with a single vehicular impact and were potentially planted. Expert witnesses disputed the prosecution's conclusions across multiple points. The allegation of coordinated misconduct involving the Canton Police Department and elements of the Massachusetts State Police was placed before the jury with supporting evidence and testimony. What the Karen Reed case did to the broader public was something very few criminal trials achieve. Social media drove the proceedings into millions of homes. Podcasts dedicated weeks to each day of testimony. Online communities formed around both interpretations, scrutinizing photographs and tracking every development in real time. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, simultaneously demanding conviction and demanding vindication. The trial became something larger than the death of one man. A referendum on whether ordinary citizens could trust law enforcement to conduct honest investigations when their own were potentially involved. The jury deliberated for days. In June 2024, the result was announced. 11 jurors voted to acquit. 1 voted to convict. The judge declared a mistrial. Reed walked out of court not guilty, not exonerated, simply unresolved. Prosecutors announced almost immediately that they would retry her. The case paused. It did not end. What makes this case structurally different from the others in this video is the specific form of institutional uncertainty it presents. In the preceding cases, a person inside law enforcement committed a crime, and the question was how detection was avoided. Here, the question inverts. Did the institutions responsible for the investigation conduct it honestly, or did they shape it toward a predetermined conclusion? Both versions remain credible. Either a woman, intoxicated and enraged, who drove away from a confrontation and left her partner to die in the snow without calling for help, or a man was beaten at a party full of officers who collectively redirected the investigation, misrepresented the evidence, and nearly sent an innocent woman to prison. Neither has been proven beyond legal doubt. John O'Keefe is dead. Karen Reed is still facing retrial, and the Boston Police Department continues to carry questions about that night and everything that followed it that have not yet been answered to anyone's satisfaction. She had a key to the restaurant. The Wu family had given it to her, the way you give a key to someone who shows up every night, who eats your food and jokes with your staff and tells your customers they are safe. That key was a symbol of everything Antoinette Frank was supposed to be. On the night of March 4th, 1995, she used it to let the danger in. Antoinette Renee Frank joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1993 during a visible push to diversify the force. She was young, ambitious, and one of only a handful of black female officers in a department with decades of fraught history. On paper, she looked like progress. Behind the badge, something else was already forming. Red flags surfaced early. Colleagues described her as reckless, undisciplined, and uninterested in the fundamentals of policing. Or more alarming was the company she kept. Rogers Lacaze was an 18-year-old with established ties to the criminal underworld and absolutely no reason to be inside a police station. Frank brought him in anyway, into restricted areas, into her patrol car, into her confidence. One senior officer later recalled that it was like watching someone train a wolf to guard the hen house. By 1995, Frank was drowning in debt and searching for a way out. The answer she chose was not legal, not quiet, and not random. She and Lacaze planned the robbery of a place she knew from the inside. The Kim An Vietnamese restaurant on Chef Monter Highway was not a target of opportunity. Frank worked there part-time as a security guard. She knew the layout, the cash on hand, and the schedule. The Wu family had welcomed her, fed her, and believed she was there to protect their livelihood. She turned all of it into a plan. Around midnight, she unlocked the door and let Lacaze inside. Off-duty NOPD officer Ronnie Williams was working security inside and had no time to respond before he was shot and killed. A colleague, a man, who wore the same badge. The Wu family members present were forced to the floor. They knew Antoinette by name. According to witness testimony later entered into court record, they called out to her. It made no difference. Ha Wu, 17 years old, and her brother Quang Wu, 24, were both killed that night. An older sister managed to hide and survived, the only family member present who lived to testify. News reached New Orleans by morning. The NOPD, already under scrutiny for corruption and misconduct, was now confronting something unprecedented. One of its officers had walked through a front door at midnight with a criminal accomplice and committed multiple killings in a room full of people who trusted her. Investigators moved quickly. Witnesses placed Frank and Lacaze at the scene. Ballistic evidence connected Frank's service weapon to the shootings. Lacaze, young and reckless, had already been talking to people about what they had done. The case was airtight before trial. Prosecutors stripped away every layer of Frank's self-presentation at trial. She had not merely participated in the robbery, she had architected it. The Kim An was her target because she knew its operations from the inside. She had chosen the timing, recruited Lacaze, and personally opened the door. The testimony from surviving Wu family members defined the emotional center of the proceeding. One account described Frank pointing her weapon at the family while smiling. That image, specific, deliberate, and deeply human, settled into the courtroom like something permanent. The jury did not deliberate long. Both Frank and Lacaze were sentenced to death. In Louisiana, female death row inmates are extremely rare. Frank became one of only a small number of women ever placed on death row in the state. In the decades since, she has filed appeals, sought clemency, and denied full culpability. Nothing has succeeded. The courts have held. The Wu family has appeared at every hearing to fight any attempt at release. What Antoinette Frank's case exposed goes beyond the individual crime. She didn't break in through a back window. She used a key given to her in good faith. The badge said she was safe. The key said the family trusted her. Both became instruments of the worst possible outcome. She remains on Louisiana's death row, one of the most reviled names in the history of New Orleans law enforcement, and a permanent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one specifically placed there to keep everyone else safe. They wore uniforms. They carried badges. They were trusted with the authority to protect human lives, and each of them turned that authority in the opposite direction. What connects these 5 cases is not just the act itself, but the institutional trust that made each one possible. The badge creates a presumption of safety. When that presumption fails, when it covers a massacre by an insider, a jealousy acted on with a service weapon, a 6-year killing spree hidden inside a police service, a possible institutional cover-up, or a cold case protected by professional loyalty for decades, the damage runs far deeper than any individual crime. The hardest question these cases leave behind is not whether justice eventually came. It is how long each situation operated in the open and what that silence cost. If these stories made you think carefully about the institutions we trust with our safety, leave a comment below. Subscribe hit the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. Here is the question. Which of these 5 cases represents the most serious failure of institutional accountability? And do you believe that failure was deliberate?